The door slammed shut with a force that echoed through the cold, sterile office. Darnell's heart raced, his breath catching in his chest as the weight of his boss's words hung in the air like a guillotine waiting to fall. "You're fired," his boss, Mr. Harris, had said, his voice cold, his eyes void of any empathy. But what Darnell couldn't understand, what he couldn't comprehend, was the why. The racist undertones, the unfair expectations, the constant microaggressions that had chipped away at his dignity, now made real in the most crushing of ways. As he stood there, his dreams crumbling before him, a dark thought crossed his mind. This is what happens when you don't fit into their idea of what you should be. The door closed behind him, leaving him standing alone on the sidewalk, cold and uncertain. Little did Mr. Harris know, this was just the beginning of a story that would echo across newsrooms and courtrooms, changing the lives of both men forever. The consequences of his decision were about to hit him in a way he never could have predicted. Darnell Walker wasn't just another face in the crowd. He had worked tirelessly to get to where he was, and yet it always felt like he had to work, twice as hard as everyone else. Growing up in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, Darnell had always dreamed of breaking free. His mother, a single parent working 2 jobs, instilled in him the belief that hard work could get you anywhere. But she also taught him something much deeper: never let anyone define your worth. It wasn't easy for him, though. Darnell had always been the only black man in the room. At his first job in an upscale law firm, he had learned quickly that merit alone wasn't always enough. He had a degree from a prestigious university, an MBA from a school many could only dream of attending, and years of experience that should have put him in the upper echelon of the business world. But the barriers kept coming. Every morning, as he rode the bus into the heart of the city, the weight of the world seemed to rest on his shoulders. The city, with its towering glass buildings and shiny cars, seemed like a world that was always just out of reach, taunting him with promises of success that often felt reserved for someone else. But Darnell wasn't the type to back down. He had spent years climbing, pushing through every door that was cracked open for him, hoping that one day his time would come. Now he found himself at a crossroads. The job he had worked so hard to secure was starting to feel like a cage. Harris & Co., a mid-sized but rapidly growing marketing firm, had been a dream job at first. The office had an open-plan design, sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that gave a stunning view of the skyline. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed to have a vision for their future, but Darnell couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His colleagues, with their well-pressed suits and confident strides, seemed to float above him in ways that made him feel like an outsider. It wasn't overt, at least not at first. The smiles they gave him were polite, if not a little forced. The invitations to happy hours were always the last to come his way, as though he were an afterthought. And when it came to important meetings, his ideas were often dismissed or credited to others. He'd learned to keep his head down and do his work. His meticulous attention to detail was one thing they couldn't ignore. But deep down, Darnell knew that his accomplishments alone wouldn't be enough to overcome the hidden biases that lurked just beneath the surface. Mr. Harris, the CEO of Harris & Comrade, was a man who commanded attention. In his mid-40s, with salt and pepper hair, he exuded the kind of authority that came with years of climbing the corporate ladder. To the outside world, Harris was a success story. His firm had expanded rapidly, landing prestigious clients in the tech and entertainment industries. He was the kind of person people admired, someone who walked into a room and immediately became the center of attention. Darnell had always been wary of him. Harris wasn't overtly rude, but there was something about his tone, the way he would look past Darnell when speaking to him, that made him feel like an invisible man in a room full of voices. And then there were the subtle comments, the kind that seemed harmless on the surface but carried a weight of meaning that Darnell could never quite ignore. They would come at the strangest times. When Harris would congratulate Darnell on a job well done, but in the same breath, comment on how impressive it was that he could deliver results despite his background. Or when Harris would make jokes about how Darnell must know how to hustle, as if his success could only be attributed to street-smart tactics rather than professional skill. Darnell had learned to smile through it, to nod and take the praise with a measured humility. But it was always there, the undercurrent of something more sinister. It wasn't just Harris. The culture of the office felt like it was built for a different kind of person, one who had gone to the right schools, who fit the right mold. Darnell had faced this before, this sense of being an outsider. But it felt different here. It felt deliberate. As much as Darnell fought against it, there was a gnawing sense of unease that followed him everywhere. He would arrive early, stay late, make sure his work was impeccable, and yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was a limit to how far he could go. He had reached the position of senior project manager, but even that came with a constant reminder. Your place here isn't permanent. One afternoon, as Darnell sat in the break room, sipping his coffee and scrolling through a report on his tablet, he overheard a conversation between a few of his colleagues. He tried to ignore it, focus on his work, but the words cut through his concentration like a blade. "I just don't know if Darnell is cut out for the big leagues," one of them said, a young woman named Emily. "I mean, I get it, he's really smart and all, but do you think he has what it takes to lead? There's just something different about him." The other voice, Ryan's, chuckled. "Yeah, I don't know, he's always so intense and kind of distant. It's like he doesn't belong here, you know?" Darnell's hand tightened around his coffee cup. The words stung, but he'd learned to live with them. What hurt the most was that they didn't even know he was listening. It wasn't meant for him. It was just another conversation happening in the background of their world. But to Darnell, it was a reminder that no matter how hard he tried, how much he succeeded, he would always be othered. He would always be the one who had to work harder, push further, and fight for a seat at the table that would never quite be his. His work ethic, his intelligence, none of it seemed to matter in a place that didn't want to see him as an equal. And that realization, that gut-wrenching understanding that he could never quite be enough, began to simmer in the pit of his stomach. Little did Darnell know that the moment of reckoning was approaching. What he didn't realize yet was that Harris and Coburn would soon make it clear just how much they didn't value him, just how little they cared about his contributions, his ideas, and most of all, his humanity. The choice that would change everything for him was coming, and when it did, the consequences would ripple far beyond the glass walls of Harris & Co. It had been a typical Thursday morning, one of those gray, drizzly days where the city felt more muted than usual. Darnell had arrived at work early, as he always did, the buzz of his colleagues' chatter still a distant hum as he settled in at his desk. He pulled up the latest client proposal, making sure it was flawless. Every detail mattered. One missed comma, one overlooked metric. Any mistake could cost the company, and that meant it could cost him. But today, something felt off. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, something more than just the usual pressure of a busy office. When Mr. Harris had called him into his office the day before, he'd assumed it was routine, just another briefing about an upcoming pitch or perhaps a review of his latest project. But the way Harris had looked at him that morning, his eyes, cold and calculating, gave Darnell a sick feeling in his stomach. The conversation had started casually enough, Harris asking about the new marketing strategy Darnell had been working on. But soon, the tone shifted. "You know, Darnell," Harris had said, leaning back in his chair and folding his arms, "I've been thinking about your approach to leadership. There's been a lot of feedback, and frankly, some of it's concerning." Darnell had blinked, confused. Feedback? From whom? From the team. From clients. From people who matter. Harris replied, his voice sharp and calculated. "You're a hard worker, I'll give you that. But I'm not sure you're ready for the next step." Darnell's pulse quickened, but he kept his composure. "I've delivered results. My numbers speak for themselves. What's the issue, sir?" Harris paused, his eyes narrowing. "The issue is that you're not a fit for the direction I want to take this company. You're just not the right kind of leader. You lack the charisma, the presence." He looked down at his desk as though examining a paperclip, not meeting Darnell's eyes. The sting of his words hit harder than Darnell had expected. He knew Harris didn't like him, didn't like the way he carried himself, the way he didn't play the game. But to hear it so directly, to hear Harris imply that his very identity was the issue, that he was the problem, was crushing. "I'm a team player, Mr. Harris," Darnell said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I'm committed to this company. I've given my all for this team, and I've always put results first. If that's not enough, I don't know what else I can do." Harris shifted in his chair, clearly not moved by Darnell's words. "Maybe it's not about the work anymore. Maybe it's about how you fit into the bigger picture. People just don't feel comfortable around you. It's hard to explain, but it's noticeable." Darnell's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to argue, to demand specifics, but the words stuck. He knew it wasn't about the work or his leadership skills. It was about something deeper, something insidious that wasn't being said aloud. It was about who he was. In the world of Harris and Koidartsum, a black man who carried himself with dignity, who didn't bow or scrape for approval, was an anomaly, a threat. The meeting had ended with Harris's thinly veiled ultimatum. Either Darnell could adjust his approach to fit in with the company's culture, or he could find somewhere else to work. It had been the first time he had been made to feel like his very existence was a disruption to the company's success. Now, as he sat at his desk, Darnell couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to take a turn for the worse. He glanced over at Emily, the young woman from the break room who had made the offhand remark about him. She was sitting in her usual spot, talking to Ryan, her voice barely rising above the hum of the office. Darnell turned back to his screen, focusing on the email he was drafting for a potential new client. But every few seconds his mind drifted back to Harris's words. By noon, Darnell had finished the client email and was reviewing his notes for an upcoming presentation. His phone buzzed with a message from his assistant, Tanya. "Meeting in 10. Mr. Harris wants you there now. Urgent." His stomach churned. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew it couldn't be good. As he entered the conference room, Darnell found Harris seated at the head of the table, flanked by two other executives, Ryan and another senior manager, Allison. Their faces were unreadable, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. "Darnell," Harris began without so much as a greeting, his tone flat. "We need to talk about the direction of your department." Darnell took a seat, his mind racing. "What's this about, sir?" "We've decided to make some changes," Harris said, his voice still as cold as before. "There are concerns about the current leadership structure, and frankly, we believe it's time to reevaluate your role." Darnell's heart sank. This is it, he thought. This is the moment where it all falls apart. "Are you suggesting that I'm not doing my job?" Darnell asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm saying that your leadership is holding us back," Harris replied, his eyes hardening. "There's a disconnect between your approach and what the company needs right now. Your style just doesn't align with the culture here. We need someone who can inspire the team, not just manage them." The words felt like a punch to the gut, but Darnell refused to let his emotion show. "I've been with this company for 3 years," he said, trying to steady his breathing. "And in that time, I've built relationships with clients, delivered results, and ensured that the team met every deadline. How does that not inspire people?" Harris leaned forward, his hands pressed flat against the table. "It's not about results anymore, Darnell. It's about fitting in, and you don't fit in here. You never have." The words hung in the air like smoke, suffocating him. Darnell couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had never been given a fair chance, never been allowed to rise without the weight of their bias crushing him from all sides. Allison, who had been silent up until that point, spoke up. "We think it might be time for a change. We're not saying you're not talented, but your style doesn't mesh with what we need right now." The finality of their words hit Darnell like a tidal wave. He was being pushed out, not because he wasn't capable, not because he hadn't delivered, but because of something deeper, something he couldn't change. He stood up slowly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "So what? You want me to leave? Harris's face remained stoic. We think it's best. You've got potential, but you're just not the right fit for where we're going. The finality of the moment settled over him like a blanket of cold. He stood there for a moment, his breath coming in shallow bursts, before forcing himself to speak again. I see. Darnell walked out of the room without another word, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him as he left the conference room, some of them pretending not to notice, others watching with a knowing expression. They knew the truth, the unspoken truth that had been there all along. As he exited the building and stepped out into the cold air, Darnell's mind raced. He had always known this day might come, but nothing could have prepared him for the crushing reality that he had been rejected, not for his work, not for his talent, but for the color of his skin. The sense of injustice burned in his chest, but there was something else too. A quiet resolve. Harris & Co. hadn't seen the last of him. The days following Darnell's firing felt like a blur, a whirlwind of emotions that left him reeling in their wake. He had expected anger. He had expected frustration. But what he hadn't expected was the deep, gnawing sense of betrayal that settled in his chest, eating away at him with every passing hour. How could he have given so much to a company that had never truly seen him? How could he have poured years of his life into a place that only valued him when it suited them? The worst part wasn't even the firing itself. It was the realization that this was the way the world worked for him, that no matter how hard he fought, no matter how much he achieved, there would always be someone like Harris waiting to make sure he never truly belonged. And yet Darnell had never felt more determined in his life. He spent the next few days holed up in his apartment, scrolling through job boards, reworking his resume, and making calls to his network. But nothing felt the same. His thoughts kept returning to the moment in Harris's office. The coldness in Harris's eyes as he dismissed him. The finality in his words. Every step he took in trying to rebuild felt like moving through quicksand. Nothing would ever be the same again. But then, a message came through that changed everything. It was a notification from the news app on his phone. At first, Darnell didn't pay much attention, his mind too clouded with the haze of his own emotions. But then he saw the headline. It was a story about Harris & Co. Reing the company he had poured his soul into. The headline read, Harris & Comer faces backlash after controversial CEO comments on diversity and leadership. His heart skipped a beat. He tapped on the article, and as the words unfolded in front of him, his blood ran cold. Apparently, during a recent interview, Harris had made a series of comments about leadership that were being interpreted as deeply racist. He had dismissed diversity initiatives, implied that black leaders were often too aggressive or too confrontational, and went so far as to suggest that his company's success was tied to a culture of like-minded individuals. It was a direct attack on everything Darnell had experienced firsthand at Harris & Co., a toxic confirmation of every subtle and not-so-subtle dismissal he had ever endured. The article went on to describe how various media outlets had picked up the story and social media was exploding with outrage. A public relations nightmare was brewing, and it wasn't long before the pressure began to mount on Harris & Co. Even investors were speaking out, and the backlash was only growing. Darnell sat back, his mind racing. He had been dismissed, fired. And now, here was the CEO, the man who had shoved him out the door being torn apart in the public eye. The irony was almost too much to bear. He had been labeled as not a fit for the company, but here was Harris, exposed for his own lack of judgment, his own inability to lead with fairness. The truth about the company's culture was now out in the open, and Darnell was left wondering just how many others had suffered the same way he had, in silence, unseen. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Tanya, his former assistant. Darnell, are you seeing this? It's all over the news. They're destroying Harris. This is your moment. He didn't know what to feel. Anger, satisfaction, or something else entirely. The part of him that had wanted to fight back, to expose the hypocrisy of it all, was now standing face to face with a decision that felt much bigger than just his personal hurt. He could let this moment pass. He could move on, look for another job and try to put this entire chapter behind him. But there was something in his gut, something deep down, that told him this was bigger than just his career. This was about justice. This was about making sure that no one else would ever have to face what he had faced. He stood up, pacing the room. The walls of his apartment felt like they were closing in on him as he thought about his next steps. What if this was his chance to truly make a difference? What if, instead of fading into the background, he used this moment to expose the truth about Harris & Co. for all the world to see? His phone buzzed again, this time with a call. It was Emily. "Darnell," she said, her voice frantic. "I don't know what to do. This is insane. The company's reputation is falling apart and they're trying to fix it. But I don't think they get how serious this is. You have to do something. People are asking questions and they're pointing fingers at you too." Darnell's stomach twisted. "They're pointing fingers at me? For what? You know how things were between you and Harris?" Everyone saw it. People are starting to connect the dots. The fact that they let you go after everything, after all the work you put in, now that this is out, it looks bad. People are talking, they're blaming you. A tight knot formed in Darnell's chest. It was one thing to be fired in silence, to be made to feel like an invisible cog in a machine. But now, the entire narrative was shifting. He wasn't just a casualty in the corporate world. He was becoming a symbol, a scapegoat for the company's failures, and he hadn't even had the chance to tell his side of the story. But the anger that had bubbled up in him since the moment he was fired was beginning to boil over. He had tried to play by the rules. He had tried to stay silent. But now, it was his time. Harris & Co. had underestimated him. And now, the truth was about to come to light. "I'm done hiding," Darnell said, his voice steady with newfound resolve. "If they want to blame me, fine, but I'm going to make sure the world knows what happened." He hung up the phone, his mind already working at full speed. The plan was simple. He would speak out. He would tell the world about Harris's bias, about the culture at Harris & Co.'s, about the systemic racism that ran deep in the company. He would make sure his story wasn't just about a job he had lost. It would be about something bigger. Something that could change the way companies viewed diversity and leadership. The storm had already started. Now it was his turn to ride the wave. He spent the next few hours drafting an open letter, pouring every ounce of his pain, frustration, and anger into each word. He described the moments, the small slights, the cold dismissals that had built up over the years. He laid bare the truth of what it felt like to be rejected, not because of his work, but because of who he was. And then, he sent it. Minutes later, his phone rang again. This time, it was a news outlet asking for an interview. The moment had come. Harris & Co. would never be the same again, and neither would Darnell. The fallout from Darnell's open letter was swift and powerful. The moment he hit send, his life irrevocably shifted. Within hours, the story of Harris & Co.'s toxic corporate culture, coupled with Darnell's first-hand account, began to spread like wildfire. Social media was ablaze with messages of support, not just for Darnell, but for all the people who had been silently suffering within the company. The power of his words gave a voice to the voiceless, and soon, people from every corner of the corporate world were speaking out. They shared their own experiences of discrimination, microaggressions, and systemic racism, stories they had hidden for so long, afraid of the repercussions. Darnell didn't realize how deep the roots of injustice had spread until he began to see the response. It wasn't just about Harris & Co. anymore. It was about an entire system that needed to change. The media attention was overwhelming. The first interview with the news outlet went viral within hours. Darnell's raw honesty, his refusal to back down in the face of adversity, and his unwavering resolve to call out the systemic issues that plagued the corporate world, resonated with viewers across the nation. His words, laden with truth and conviction, made people listen. They saw the courage in his eyes, the pain in his voice, and they recognized the injustice. For the first time in a long while, Darnell felt seen, not as an employee, not as a token, to be checked off in a diversity report, but as a person with value, with a voice worth hearing. The board of directors at Harris & Co. could no longer ignore the storm raging in the media. The pressure was mounting from every side: investors, customers, employees, even politicians. And soon, the company was forced to act. The first domino fell when Harris, the CEO, was forced to issue a public apology, not just for his comments but for the harmful culture he had fostered within the company. It was a weak apology, laced with excuses, but it was a start. The media wasn't satisfied, and neither was Darnell. The apology wasn't enough. It didn't change the fact that he had been pushed out because of his race, or that countless others had faced the same fate. Darnell knew the game wasn't over, but he also knew that the conversation was no longer in Harris's hands. It was in his. Days later, the company issued a statement announcing a complete overhaul of their diversity and inclusion policies. They promised to implement new training programs, reevaluate their hiring practices, and work with external consultants to help shift the culture. It was clear, however, that the damage had been done. No amount of corporate lip service could erase the truth now. Harris & Co. was on the verge of collapse, and Darnell was at the epicenter of that shift. But Darnell didn't feel vindicated by the company's token efforts. He wasn't interested in their promises. What mattered now was the change that could be made, not just in one company but across the entire corporate landscape. He'd become more than a whistleblower. He was a symbol of resistance, a symbol that no one could ignore. As the company floundered in the wake of the scandal, Darnell began to receive calls from other organizations, from both within and outside his industry, all asking the same thing. What can we do to fix this? It wasn't just about fixing the culture at Harris & Co. It was about fixing a broken system, a system that dehumanized Black employees and pushed them out the door simply for existing as they were. Darnell's former assistant, Tanya, called him one afternoon after hearing the news of the changes Harris & Co. was attempting to implement. She sounded hopeful but also cautious. "Darnell, do you think they're really going to change, or is this just a PR move?" He paused, reflecting on everything that had happened. "They've made a statement. They've promised to change. But it's not enough. Not for me. Not for the people who are still stuck in that system, feeling like they have to hide who they are just to get ahead." "You're right," she said quietly. "So, what's next?" "Next?" Darnell's voice was firm, full of purpose. "Next, I'm going to make sure this conversation doesn't die. I'm going to work with others who've been marginalized, who've been forced to conform to a culture that doesn't see them. We're going to build something better, something that doesn't need to tear us down in order to succeed." Over the next few weeks, Darnell began working with other corporate leaders, diverse leaders, people of color, and allies who were tired of watching their colleagues suffer in silence. He helped form a network of companies dedicated to authentic diversity and inclusion, not just in terms of hiring, but in terms of leadership, culture, and power dynamics. Together, they created a new set of standards, a framework for accountability that emphasized human dignity above all else. At the heart of the network was a simple idea. True leadership wasn't about fitting into a mold. It was about empowering others to be their authentic selves. The companies that adopted these principles flourished. They saw higher retention rates, stronger employee satisfaction, and better financial performance. They weren't just ticking boxes. They were creating a culture where everyone, regardless of race or background, could thrive. As for Harris & Co. and Roos, their efforts to rebuild their image came too late. The public had seen through their hollow attempts at reform. Their stock price plummeted, and several high-profile investors pulled out. The company was forced to make drastic changes, including replacing Harris as CEO and hiring a new leadership team committed to real reform. But for Darnell, none of that mattered. He had done what he set out to do: expose the system, hold them accountable, and create space for something better to take root. One evening, as Darnell sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through the latest news updates, he saw a headline that stopped him cold. Harris and Cohen to resign from publicly stated diversity commitment amid backlash. Darnell smiled to himself. It wasn't the victory he had imagined when he first took his stand, but it was a victory nonetheless. He had won, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been silenced, sidelined, or made to feel like they didn't belong. His phone buzzed with a text from Tanya. "I'm so proud of you." Darnell leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of everything he had fought for. The injustice, the pain, the frustration. It was all there in the background. But now there was something else too. Hope. This battle was not just about one man's struggle to be seen. It was about changing the system for everyone. It was about creating a world where no one would ever have to fight to be recognized for their worth, their talent, their humanity. And with that thought, Darnell knew he had truly won, not just for himself, but for all of us. Darnell's journey, from employee to whistleblower, from a nameless cog in a corporate machine, to a public figure standing against the systemic racism that pervades the business world, represents more than just the personal transformation of one individual. It is a microcosm of a much larger societal issue that stretches far beyond corporate boardrooms and one that touches every facet of our lives. The story raises fundamental questions about race, power, and systemic inequality, questions that have been asked for centuries but, despite decades of progress, continue to be as relevant today as they were when the civil rights movement began. At its core, the narrative sheds light on how institutionalized racism continues to manifest in places where diversity should be not only celebrated, but integrated into the very fabric of the culture. Darnell's struggle, his fight for visibility, for validation, for respect, is not unique to him. It is the lived reality of countless Black employees, not just in corporate America, but across the world. This story serves as a powerful reminder of how systemic racism and discrimination are ingrained in the structures that govern our lives, particularly in institutions that shape our professional and economic opportunities. For years, businesses have spoken the language of diversity and inclusion. Corporate leaders have issued statements of support, promising to create environments where individuals of all races, genders, and backgrounds can succeed. Yet, despite the rhetoric, when it comes to actual change, the disparity between promise and practice is staggering. Research shows that while Black Americans make up 13% of the U.S. population, they account for only 3% of executive roles in major companies. In fact, a report from McKinsey & Company found that companies in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity are 35% more likely to have financial returns above their national industry median. And yet, even with these findings, progress is slow. The reasons behind this are complex but rooted in centuries of systemic inequities that continue to limit opportunities for marginalized communities. The history of racism in corporate spaces is long, stretching back to a time when Black workers were barred from many professions or relegated to the lowest-paying, least visible jobs. While the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made it illegal to discriminate on the basis of race, the battle for true equality has never truly ended. The corporate world may have seen more Black faces in the workforce over the years, but the structures that allowed racism to thrive have remained largely intact. At its most insidious, corporate racism is not overt. It is not always the blatant bigotry of the past. It is the invisible, unspoken bias that shapes decision-making, hiring practices, promotions, and everyday interactions. The cycle of bias Darnell experienced, the undermining of his achievements, the constant feeling of being othered, the subtle but persistent rejection, is a form of structural violence. It's violence that may not always involve physical harm, but the psychological toll is just as real. For many Black professionals, the experience of being passed over, ignored, or outright discriminated against at work leaves a lasting scar, one that is passed down to future generations as they enter the workforce. This form of racism is as harmful, if not more so, because it is so often cloaked in neutrality and disguised as meritocracy. The unspoken message is clear: you are not enough as you are. You must work harder, be better, prove your worth in ways that your white counterparts never have to. This is the larger systemic issue that Darnell's story illuminates: the gap between the image company's project and the reality they uphold. Harris & Coers may have issued statements about diversity and inclusion, but their practices did not reflect those values. The company's real culture, the culture that drove Darnell out, was one that devalued his contributions, his perspective, and ultimately, his identity. When Harris, the CEO, made his public comments about diversity, it was as though the mask slipped for a moment, revealing the true face of the company, one that only valued diversity when it was convenient, when it fit into the narrow vision of what leadership should look like. The lessons learned from this story are crucial if we are to address these broader societal issues. First, we must recognize that diversity, equity, and inclusion are not just buzzwords. They are moral imperatives. They are not values that can be implemented in a half-hearted manner, or worse, as a PR stunt. The dismantling of systemic racism in any organization requires a deep and sustained commitment, one that goes beyond quotas and training sessions. It requires a fundamental shift in the way people are seen, valued, and treated. The broader community of marginalized groups, especially people of color, continue to fight for recognition and respect in spaces where their contributions should already be acknowledged. This is why Darnell's story, while rooted in one man's journey, resonates with a broader cultural movement. His triumph is not just a personal victory. It is a call to action for those in positions of power and influence to finally confront their biases and begin to implement lasting, tangible change. One of the critical ways we can begin to address these issues is by implementing policies that ensure true accountability in the workplace. Companies must be held responsible for more than just meeting diversity quotas. They must be evaluated based on how inclusive and equitable their workplace cultures are. This includes promoting people of color into leadership roles, removing barriers to career advancement for marginalized groups, and offering support and mentorship programs for those who have historically been excluded. Additionally, we need to create environments where people can feel safe speaking out about injustices without fear of retaliation. Darnell's decision to speak out, while courageous, was a gamble. Whistleblowers are often vilified, their reputations smeared, and their careers destroyed. For real change to occur, we must support individuals who choose to expose wrongdoing and protect them from the consequences of doing so. This protection should not just come from internal company policies, but from external laws and societal norms that prioritize justice over corporate interests. Perhaps most importantly, we must educate and train leaders across every industry on what it means to be truly inclusive. It's not enough to simply hire diverse talent if those individuals are not given the support and resources to succeed. We need leaders who understand that inclusivity is not about tokenism. It's about ensuring that everyone, regardless of race, has an equal opportunity to thrive. Training in unconscious bias, cultural competency, and inclusive leadership is crucial in fostering an environment where every individual is seen for who they truly are. This issue is not limited to corporations. It extends into government, education, healthcare, and every institution that holds power. Darnell's story, while centered in the corporate world, speaks to a larger narrative about the ways in which institutions perpetuate inequality. It's about the stories of countless individuals who never make the headlines, who remain unheard, who suffer in silence. Darnell's stand against Harris & Co. is part of a larger cultural awakening that has been gaining momentum for years. The Black Lives Matter movement, for example, has shed light on the disproportionate ways in which Black people are treated in society, from police brutality to workplace discrimination. The fight for racial justice is a long one, but every small victory, every story like Darnell's, is a step toward a future where equality is not just an aspiration but a reality. Ultimately, Darnell's story is a reminder of the power of the individual in the face of overwhelming adversity. It demonstrates the importance of speaking truth to power, of using one's voice to expose corruption, and of never backing down in the pursuit of justice. But it also speaks to the larger societal need for structural change. Change that is not just about creating a more inclusive workplace, but a more just and equitable society for all. In the end, Darnell didn't just change Harris & Co. he became part of a much larger movement. His story isn't just about one man's triumph over corporate injustice. It's a reflection of the ongoing fight for equality and justice in all spheres of life. It's a story that will continue to inspire, challenge, and move us until we finally create the kind of world where no one has to fight for the right to simply exist as they are. As we close the chapter on Darnell's powerful journey, we are left with a sobering truth. The fight for justice, for equality, for the dignity of every individual, regardless of race, gender, or background, is far from over. But it is also a fight that we cannot afford to ignore. Darnell's courage has illuminated the path for us all, showing us that it is possible to stand up, to speak out, to challenge the injustices that so often go unnoticed or are accepted as the status quo. His story is not just a reminder of how far we still have to go, but of how much power each of us holds to make a difference. It's easy to believe that one person cannot bring about change, that the system is too big, too entrenched, too powerful. But Darnell has proven otherwise. In one letter, in one act of courage, he became the catalyst for a conversation that has spread across industries, communities, and even generations. He took a stand not just for himself, but for everyone who has ever been marginalized, silenced, or dismissed. He reminds us that the voice of one can echo across the world, inspiring others to join the call for justice. But the truth is, Darnell's victory is not the end of the fight. It's just the beginning. Now it's time for each of us to step into that same light, to raise our voices and use our platforms to demand change, to hold corporations, institutions, and individuals accountable for the systems of oppression they uphold. It's time for us to stand in solidarity, not just with those who have suffered, but with those who are still fighting their battles every single day. This is a call to action, a call to you, to us all. It's time to take a hard look at the systems that govern our world, systems that were built on the backs of those who were never meant to succeed, who were told they didn't belong. It's time to dismantle those systems brick by brick and build something better, something more inclusive, something that reflects the true worth and value of every human being. How can we take part in this change? The first step is simple. Listen. Listen to the stories of those around us, especially those whose voices have been ignored or erased. Take the time to understand their struggles, their fears, and their triumphs. Create spaces where those voices are heard and valued, not just in the workplace, but in every aspect of our society. Next, educate ourselves. Understanding the history of systemic racism is essential to understanding how it continues to manifest today. We must educate ourselves on how bias works, how it impacts every part of our lives, and how we can actively work to combat it. This is not a one-time effort. It is a lifelong commitment to learning, growing, and becoming better allies, better leaders, and better human beings. Then, take action. Whether it's calling out injustice when we see it, standing up for someone who has been silenced, or supporting organizations and businesses that prioritize inclusivity and diversity, every action counts. Change starts with us, but it doesn't stop with us. It ripples out, touching those around us, creating a force that is impossible to ignore. This story of Darnell is just one of many. But if we all take a piece of his courage, his conviction, and his unwavering belief in justice, we can spark a fire that will ignite change on a scale we have never seen before. A world where no one is forced to hide who they are, where every voice is valued, and where equality is not just an ideal, but a reality. We have the power to make that world a reality, but only if we act. Only if we choose to rise above the complacency that allows injustice to persist. Only if we choose to believe that each of us has a role to play in creating a more just, more inclusive world. As you reflect on Darnell's story, I ask you to think about the role you want to play in this movement. Will you stand by, silent, or will you raise your voice no matter how small, no matter how difficult? Will you accept the world as it is, or will you help create a world where every person, no matter their background, can thrive? It's time to act. It's time to be the change we want to see. The question is no longer if we can change the world, but if we are willing to. Are you ready to join this fight? To stand with Darnell and with all those who fight for justice, for equality, and for humanity? The world is waiting for us to act. Let's not waste any more time. Share this story. Share it with your friends, your family, your coworkers. Let them know that this fight is not over and that their voices matter. Let them know that we will not stop until we create a world where everyone is seen, heard, and valued for who they truly are. It's time to unite. It's time to rise. Let's stand together and make the change that we so desperately need. The time for justice is now. The time for equality is now. The time for action is now. Together, we can create a better future for Darnell, for every person who has been wronged, and for all of us.